My name is Dr. Anika Molesworth, and I'm a farmer in Australia.
My name is Sylvia Kuria, and I'm a small-scale organic farmer based in Nairobi.
I became very interested in climate change when I was a child. When I was 12 years old, we had a very bad drought.
I think for me, what has really driven me is that for a long time, the narrative has been that safe organic produce is only for a chosen few, because what has happened is organic produce for a long time has actually been seen as a niche product.
Hello, welcome to the Cha Kula Podcast, where we delve into the pressing issues shaping our food and farming systems. I'm your host, Philistas Mwalia. The Cha Kula Podcast is a podcast of the Root to Food Initiative, which is a program of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. We work on agroecology and pushing for the realization of the human right to food in Kenya. Agrifood systems remain highly vulnerable to shocks and disruptions arising from climate change, conflicts, and economic contraction, among other factors. These factors, combined with growing inequalities, keep challenging the capacity of agri-food systems to deliver nutritious, safe, and affordable diets for all. These major drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition are not our new normal. We have no option but to redouble our efforts to transform our food systems, or basically our agri-food systems, and leverage them towards reaching the SDG 2 targets. These words are not words from myself or basically from the Root to Food Initiative, but rather words that have been quoted on the State of Food and Nutrition Security, the SOFI report, 2022 report. And today's discussion, we shall be delving on one of the many factors of food insecurity, that's climate change. And we have the pleasure of having two farmers in the studio. The two farmers, I would say they operate in two similar contexts, but two different contexts. I don't know if that makes sense, but we have Sylvia Kuria, who's an organic farmer here in Kenya, and we have Dr. Anika Molesworth, who's also a farmer. She's based in Australia. She's a farmer, and she also doubles as a scientist and a storyteller. Thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps you could give an introduction to our listeners on who Sylvia is and who Dr. Anika is, and why are you working in this space, and why is this space so important to you, and why is climate change an important topic for the both of you as farmers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on this show, Feli, and it's a real honor to be here with Sylvia, also a farmer. So my name is Dr. Anika Molesworth, and I'm a farmer in Australia, and I live on my family's farm where we have sheep and goats. And I became very interested in climate change when I was a child. When I was 12 years old, we had a very bad drought that lasted 10 years. And so for 10 years, we had little to no rainfall, and I watched the vegetation disappear, the dust storms, the sandstorms come, every week. The temperature was getting hotter. We had to sell all the sheep and the goats. And I watched the people in my community also suffer. They were moving to the cities because of this drought event. And as a young person, I was really concerned about what was happening around me and the impact it was having on my farm, this place that I loved, and the people that I really care about, my family and my community. And so I started to question, how do we farm sustainably in the most environmentally responsible way, and how do we manage climate change so that the next generation of farmers have a climate safe world to grow food in? So to answer your question, why food? Because it is the foundation of any society. If we have good food, then we have good human nutrition, so we can go and learn in our schools, we can get a job. It means social stability. It means the opportunity to do things. But when we have broken food systems, especially food systems that have been broken by climate change, that's when we see people going hungry. That's when we see unemployment, we see conflict, and we also see the degradation of the natural world. So that's why food is so important to me. And I'll hand over to Sylvia.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Anika. My name is Sylvia Kuria, and I'm a small-scale organic farmer based in Nairobi. Just about 60 kilometers from Nairobi is where we have our mixed farm, where we have beef cattle, and we also keep lots of vegetables. We grew lots of vegetables. I think for me, this conversation, is very important because, I actually grew up in the city. So I was actually born and bred in the city and only moved out to the country when I got my first child. That was about 15 years ago. And I remember, when we moved out into the country is when I started being really connected to the land. Being in the city, I think I was very oblivious to the fact of how food is grown. And I remember, being given half an acre to start growing my own family food. And that was the very first time, I got to interact with pests. And I was very surprised that people were spraying chemicals, on the food that, we should be eating. And I think for me, that's when, my nudge to actually know how to grow safe food for my family was actually, grown in that space, because I was just so surprised that, people were growing, lots of good food, but then had to douse the food with, so many pesticides and stuff. And that's when I actually got to read and learn more about farming. And I actually chose to become an organic farmer and realized that the importance of this is just to make sure that, I'm able to make sure that my children and my family are able to be fed well. But then beyond that, we have actually grown to train and work with smallholder farmers, especially women, to be able to grow their own kitchen gardens, to make sure that they have access to good food for their families all year round. And also beyond that, be able to make the food accessible. So we have a shop. We have Sylvia's Basket, a brand name whereby we actually have organic farm shops where we supply, some safe organic produce to young mothers just like me out there in the city. And one thing I always say is that, when we encourage people to actually go out and look for safe organic produce, my consumers in Nairobi may not be able to grow food. When we as farmers grow food sustainably and consumers buy food that is grown sustainably, we all work together to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. And we are able to actually put a stamp and actually say that, we are going to make sure the food is grown well, and consumers will make sure that they're only going to consume food that is grown sustainably. And I think as we work together as producers and consumers, in this quest for sustainability, then we can actually be able to reduce the negative impacts of climate change. And as Dr. Anika said, maybe in a small way, fix the broken food systems.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you so much, Dr. Anika. That's truly inspiring. And it's quite interesting that the both of you have some similarities and commonalities. For instance, your profound connection to the land and your dedication to addressing climate change in agriculture, basically through the measures that you're taking to address climate change as farmers. Perhaps you could just share with our listeners some of the pivotal moments or experiences during the work that you've been doing that sparked your passion for creating a better, more sustainable future for our planet through agri-food systems and through agriculture.
Yes, certainly. Well, I guess the drought when I was a child was the thing that drove me to be concerned about climate change. But something that really sparked my passion and excitement, I guess, to work in this space was when we founded an organization here in Australia called Farmers for Climate Action. And we have now 8,000 farmers part of this network. And these farmers, they're all over Australia. They produce all kinds of foods and fibers. They're very diverse, but they all have a passion to learn how to mitigate the effects of climate change, to adapt and to restore the health of our natural ecosystems. And just being surrounded by people like that, who are driven and determined and who dream of a better future, is something that just gives me so much energy and so much hope for a sustainable future and for sustainable agriculture.
I think for me, it's similar to what I'd actually said earlier on. It's just to, I think for me, what has really driven me is that for a long time, the narrative has been that safe organic produce is only for a chosen few, because what has happened is organic produce for a long time has actually been seen as a niche product. And when you say the word niche, you already say that it's only for those who can be able to afford, or only for a specific part in the community that is able to access it. And for me, I actually thought to myself, no, organic, safe produce is actually a fundamental human right. Every single person should actually be able to access safe food. And I think for me, what I just wanted to see happening, within my space and in the work that we're doing, is to make organic produce, one, affordable. And when you make it affordable, then you're able to make it accessible. And that's the thing that we have really been working hard at, to make sure that it's very accessible. Young mothers are able to get it. We're able to make sure that we are raising our families and our children, from the right start, eating the right food. And maybe just to give a quick example, our second branch, we've opened a new branch of Sylvia's Basket in a, quite a populous area. And, it's in an area where they don't have access to fresh farm produce. And for us having a branch there, I remember yesterday at the shop, having a young lady who walked in to buy some produce for her ailing grandmother. And she said, I'm so grateful that we can actually be able to afford and we can be able to access, safe produce for my family. And for me, that really touched me, that the work we're doing is actually growing in leaps and bounds, in that we are making it accessible to as many people as possible.
That's truly impressive, Sylvia, given the fact that you're trying to, not even trying, given the fact that you're producing food in a way that doesn't compromise. Basically, you're producing food in a way that won't jeopardize the environment, basically, in ensuring that even future generations will be able to grow food in the same piece of land. But Dr. Anika, in your extensive work as a scientist, I know the definition of climate change might seem easy to everyone, but I know 100% it's also not easy for everyone. In your extensive work as a scientist, could you share with our listeners in layman's language what climate change is?
Yeah, so climate change is when the world is being heated by the sun's rays, but because we're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it's like it's making a thick blanket in the atmosphere. And so when the sun's rays come and warm the earth, they then can't escape. And so we end up with this heating around the world. And obviously this impacts all things. It impacts the land, it impacts the water, it impacts, native biodiversity, plants and animals, and of course the food and farming systems which we all depend upon. And because we are releasing greenhouse gas emissions, especially by the burning of coal, oil and gas, that's having a really big impact. But these emissions come from all different sectors, from, the way we transport ourselves and our goods, the ways we grow food and fibers in agricultural systems, the way we manufacture and use industrial processes. And it's also the removal of carbon sinks like forests, which actually take in carbon and give oxygen. So when we remove those natural carbon sinks, that's also exacerbating the problem.
Just my main question here, you see, at the beginning, I introduced yourself as a scientist and someone who also shares stories around climate change, around food, and around sustainable food and farming systems. Perhaps, Dr. Anika, you could take us back on where are we going wrong? Also, where are we? And how agriculture is a key path to our solution, basically. Over to you, Dr. Anika.
Yeah, so agriculture is a very interesting part of the climate change puzzle, because it is a producer of greenhouse gas emissions, as in our ruminant animals like cattle and sheep and goats, they burp methane, which is quite a strong greenhouse gas. We're also working with the soil, releasing carbon dioxide there if we remove vegetation. So there's many ways that agriculture is contributing to climate change. We're also one of the most vulnerable sectors to the impacts of climate change. So when we have a drought or a flood or a wildfire or different pests and diseases, the farmers are the people who feel it first, and they feel it worst because they live and work so closely with the natural environment. But the exciting piece of the puzzle is that agriculture is a key part of the solution. So when we improve our agricultural practices, we reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. When we improve the way we produce food in our farming systems, we have better food security. And so when we talk about climate solutions and where we are going and where we want to get to, agriculture has to be, at the center of those conversations. And so when I think about how do we use agriculture as a solution and, where we can reduce emissions, we can reduce methane from our livestock with better breeding, so we have better genetics, and improve the health of our livestock, because sick livestock, they use resources, they may die, so they're producing greenhouse gases unnecessarily without producing a food source. We can also change the way that we're using land, so we can plant more trees, agroforestry or reforestation. We can use native foods. So native plants often use less chemicals. They're better suited to the soils and the climate, so they need less inputs. We can also look at electrifying our businesses. So moving away from those fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, and using solar panels and wind turbines to power our homes and our businesses. So there are many, many solutions out there which can be adopted by farmers and by rural communities, but they will be tweaked and tailored so they are appropriate for each community.
Dr. Anika, I want to open another box now that you're talking about some of the climate change solutions. And you talked about agriculture heavily, and I know you as a farmer. But Dr. Anika, the box that I want to open is on fertilizers. There's so much conversation there. Basically, there's so much conversation happening around fertilizers, and we see so many governments embracing fertilizers and urging farmers to actually embrace fertilizers to produce more food. But from a scientific perspective and from you as a farmer, is this really a short-term solution to ensuring that a lot of food is produced, but in the long term, do fertilizers really have effects on climate change? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So fertilizer use is a very interesting part of the conversation because urea, which is a nitrogen fertilizer, helps crops to grow and grow productively and quickly and produce larger quantities of grain or produce. But a lot of that nitrogen is actually lost when nitrogen fertilizer like urea is applied. Only about 40% is actually taken up by the crop. And so that nitrogen either, leaches into the soil and water table or gets released into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which again is a very potent greenhouse gas. So we have to be very careful when we are using fertilizers to apply them at the right time, at the right rate, at the right placement, and at the right quantity, so that the plant is actually utilizing those nutrients, taking them up, producing an edible food for us, and so that nitrogen is not being lost to the atmosphere. So it's very critical that farmers understand best fertilizer use practices.
Sylvia, do you have anything that you'd like to add specifically around where we are going wrong, specifically for you as a farmer here in Kenya? And also, I know you've talked about some of the mitigating measures that you're taking, but also do you have any challenges that you're really facing as a farmer that are linked to climate change?
Yeah, of course, the major challenge, that we've been dealing with, it's interesting to listen to Dr. Anika saying they had a drought for 10 years. I mean, my heart just cuddled because I was like, I can't imagine 10 years because, for us, we've had a drought for 2.5 years here in Kenya, and it's been really, really difficult. The weather patterns being very unpredictable, I think for us has been our major challenge right now, because we're just not able to to plan and to be able to predict how to plant, when to plant, and when like which crops to plant. But maybe just to quickly mention two major challenges, and for me I'm just going to focus on the sector in agriculture because that's where I'm at and that's where I feel that I have more knowledge and experience. And one of it is basically the issue to do with monocropping. When we had the Green Revolution, which was introduced, in Africa in the early 2000s, whereby we were told that we need to plant lots of maize and do lots of monocropping on large parcels of land so that we can be food secure. Unfortunately, this didn't, translate into food security. Many years down the line, this monocropping and green revolution has actually really compromised on our food security. It's compromised on our, especially biodiversity. Something else that has happened, because we don't have good biodiversity, which means that we have made sure that now, a consequence of that is that nature is not able to fight for itself. And, when you have those sort of gaps, then you find that we have to use a lot of inputs, synthetic inputs, in terms of the fertilizer we've talked about. We use a lot of pesticides and herbicides just to be able to grow this one crop on thousands of acres. So the solution for me, go back to increasing our biodiversity, go back to growing our local indigenous foods. Our local indigenous foods are actually resilient, to the effects of climate change. Our local foods are nutrient dense. They are able to grow very well in harsh conditions. They are more readily available. So I think for us, we should go back to diversity, number one. Number two, go back to growing our own food. And when we do that, we'll actually be able to bring back our biodiversity. And with that, we'll actually be able to, somehow survive these negative effects that have come upon us right now.
Dr. Anika, I really want to take advantage for the fact that I have you in studio today and ask as many questions as possible. And one question that I really want to ask is around carbon credits. It's a fairly new topic for me. So perhaps, do you have any insights that you would really like to share with our listeners on what this is all about? And is it really a climate change solution?
Yes, certainly. So this is a relatively new term that has emerged, the carbon credits and the carbon market. So it's really being paid to sequester carbon, and you get a credit, I guess, for that, to produce carbon too. So for instance, a manufacturing company is wanting to, produce clothes or cars, and they know that they're releasing a certain amount of carbon dioxide in that process, but they want to offset their carbon emissions. And by doing that, they will pay, for example, a farmer to plant trees. And as those trees grow, they're taking up carbon dioxide, and, putting carbon in their trunks and their branches and leaves and roots and into the soil. And so the farmer is getting paid to, do carbon farming. So this is a relatively new market here in Australia as well. And it's still, being developed and evolving, what prices people are being paid to sequester carbon, what are these carbon credits worth? So I think it will be a very interesting topic and interesting space over the next few years to see what emerges in different countries around the world. But the main way that we're going to solve climate change is not by offsetting emissions, it's actually by reducing our emissions. So the industries, the manufacturers, the energy producers, energy from coal, oil and gas, they actually need to reduce the amount of emissions they're releasing, not offsetting them, saying we will continue to do what we've always done, but we will pay a farmer to plant some trees as a substitute, because that doesn't actually solve this problem that we are in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. You had mentioned about monocultures and also relying so much on external inputs like pesticides. But do you also have anything else that you'd like to add on where we are going wrong, specifically from the context where we're operating in Kenya?
Okay, maybe let me just say real quick. I think we've really focused on, let me put it this way. 80% of the food that is produced, in the world, is produced by small-scale farmers. I think we're in agreement of that. And what has happened is, like in as much as the smallholder farmers are the ones producing the food that we eat, we still are not able to, work with them adequately for us to actually be able to combat the negative effects of climate change. So sometimes I feel that, a lot of focus is still being put on, the large scale farmers who are mainly growing food that is exported. And, we've talked about, how we transport our food and how we travel is actually affecting, the climate. We are increasing on our greenhouse gases by just the way we transport our foods and things of the sort. And yet, if we are able to focus on the local smallholder farmers, make sure that, we are growing food sustainably, and even, having something like local and territorial markets, whereby we're making sure food doesn't have to travel thousands of kilometers from the farm to our plates. So I think for me, that's another thing that we are quite passionate about, to make sure that, one, we focus on smallholder farmers, and two, make sure we are able, to grow local territorial markets, and making sure that food doesn't have to travel for large distances. So over and above being able to make sure we are growing food sustainably, then we should also have sustainable markets, so to speak, and avoid having traveling like for long distances. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Anika, anything to add?
I'm very inspired by everything that Sylvia is saying, actually, and it really fills me with hope that we can have this beautiful future if we are courageous now and change the things that we recognize are not working anymore. Because we do have a lot of options out there, a lot of ways that we can improve the way that we're managing land and producing foods. And I think everyone, not just farmers, but everyone who eats food should be part of these important conversations and advocating for better food systems.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. Dr. Anika, now around the discussion on climate solutions, are there any other innovative strategies that you've left behind that we'd really love to add to the discussion today?
One that I would like to mention is animal health. And I was reading a study this week about greenhouse gas emissions in Kenyan dairy systems. And if Kenyan farmers are able to deworm their cattle and make them healthier, this could reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by about 20%. And so over the course of a year, that would save about 8 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, increase the Kenyan dairy sector by a revenue of about $2 billion US, helping to lift farmers out of poverty. And obviously, if we have healthier animals and more productive livestock, then we don't need to expand agriculture into natural environments. So we can actually produce food on less land size and save the ecosystems and biodiversity. Also, having healthier animals and, healthier dairy cows would give the average Kenyan about 2 kilograms of extra protein per year. So that was just a very simple case study that I was reading about that is an example of, how you can achieve better health for the environment, better human health, better animal welfare, and better economic growth all together by, helping farmers reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a win-win.
We've now come to the end of the show. And thank you so much, Dr. Anika, for sharing your insights. And also thank you so much, Sylvia, for sharing your insights. Do you have any parting shots that you'd love to leave our listeners with?
I think for me, let me just jump in here real quick. I'm been so inspired by Dr. Anika, and I'd love to meet her one of the days, because I just find that, that we are doing the same thing, like in our different spaces. And I think I've learned a lot also about the climate change, and also the final comment that she talked about animal health. I think that really inspires me, because I'm an upcoming beef farmer, and I think what she's speaking about, has really touched my heart. And I think just for me to also just share with the listeners, that, we still have food heroes. We still have people all around the world, very passionate about our food systems. And I think if we're to work together, like I said, farmers move to more sustainable farming practices, and consumers making choices to grow food that is farmed sustainably, I think we'll be able to make a big difference in the climate change challenges that we are facing right now. Thank you very much, Feli, for this time. Asante.
Yeah, likewise. Just amazing to hear what Sylvia has been saying. And I think for your listeners, everyone eats food. So we are all part of this conversation. We are all part of the food systems. And so I think it's really important that we're all climate champions and advocating for healthier farming and food systems and a healthier world by acting on climate change. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And thank you so much, Dr. Anika, first for creating time, for sharing your insights with us, and also for ensuring that the discussion has actually been very, very interesting and very insightful. We don't take it for granted. And we really hope this is not the end of the discussion, but rather the beginning of a partnership and the beginning of a discussion that is actually very important around our food and farming systems. Thank you. And thank you so much to our listeners for tuning in. We really hope you found this discussion to be interesting and insightful for you. Please give us a 5-star rating on Spotify and also on Apple Podcast and all the podcast platforms where we're listening from. Give us a 5-star. Also share the podcast around. Thank you.